All right. I gave you, and just one clarification on the group. I saw some of you were maybe worried about it. I said cobweb, and it's not in your notes because I will give you the notes. All right, but I said cobweb. Cobweb is related to equilibrium, so we will talk about it today. We have to talk about 2-3 things on equilibrium today. So beginning with first things first. Yesterday we stopped after taking a discussion, starting a discussion on existence and uniqueness of equilibrium. So we will first discuss existence of equilibrium. Existence of equilibrium. So we will talk about existence and uniqueness. Again I repeat, existence means that equilibrium is there. Existence का मतलब equilibrium exist करता है. Equilibrium is established. That is existence of equilibrium. Uniqueness of equilibrium is that equilibrium exists and is singular. एक ही जगह पर equilibrium है. But existence means equilibrium is there. So remember, when we say existence of equilibrium, it means this implies that there is at least one point of intersection between demand and supply curves. That is the idea of existence of equilibrium. That there is at least one point of intersection between demand and supply curve. आज भी नहीं आ रहा विकास. No, it's not actually mathematically wrong, but it's more about not being correct in the technical sense of the term. But you can always take Q on the x-axis, and P on the y-axis. But that is the inverse curve rather than the direct curve. But the results will remain the same. All right. Now see, what we will do here is, after this, when you are writing an answer, you can begin writing with this. Then what you should do is you should draw an equilibrium, the normal equilibrium, and you should say that if we take quantity and we take price, demand curve, supply curve, Q1, P1, and we can say the figure shows that equilibrium exists at point E where price is determined such that willingness to pay for Q1 by consumer matches willingness to sell at Q1 by producer. That is what we have to bring across. That figure shows that equilibrium exists at point E where price is determined such that willingness to pay for Q1 by consumer matches willingness to sell at Q1 by producer. So this is what we bring across. This is what we bring across when we talk about willingness to pay and willingness to consume. All right, that is the basic idea. Willingness to pay and willingness to consume. Now remember, this is the way I'm deliberately doing this again. I'm trying to teach you methods by which you create words. So the question was about commenting on stability and uniqueness of equilibrium, uniqueness and existence of equilibrium. So that meant that on these two topics, we had to write 150 words. So if we write something like 70-75 words on, or 60-70 words on existence, and then if we write 60-70 words on uniqueness, that will cover the entire picture for us. So that is what we begin with. We write, how does the equilibrium exist, first of all. So exists means that there should be a point of intersection of demand and supply curves. Now, there can be non-standard demand and supply curves also, and even there the equilibrium can exist. For example, we saw it yesterday, demand curve can be upward sloping, supply curve can be downward sloping, and still the equilibrium can exist. Alright, so in that case again, the bottom line is that there is at least one point of intersection between demand and supply curves. So this is our initial 35 words to cover this. Now what we will do is, we will take the 2-3 exceptional cases and use 10-15 words for each of them to create our 70 words for uniqueness, or for existence. Alright, for example, we can say that, after having written this, we can say that, however, it is possible that the curves don't intersect in certain cases. It is possible that the curves don't intersect in certain cases. Now what can be those certain cases where the curves don't intersect? So we take them up one by one, and we can take, for example, and then we take quantity, we take price, we take the supply curve, we take the demand curve. That kind of a thing. We take quantity, we take price, we take the supply curve, we take the demand curve. Where supply curve is upward sloping and demand curve is downward sloping, but they never meet each other. And we can then explain this portion of by elaborating on when will it happen. So if we have drawn this up, then that will imply, I can get rid of this. That will imply that what we can get, I'm talking after this, what we can get, we can write, and you can call this PS, and you can call this PB. The intercept point of demand curve can be called PB, and the intercept point of supply curve can be called PS. And then we can write, if minimum willingness to sell represented by PS is greater than maximum willingness to pay represented by PB, then there is no existence of equilibrium. That is another aspect of it. That if minimum willingness to sell represented by PS is greater than maximum willingness to pay represented by PB, then there is no existence of equilibrium. So, see, the whole idea is that put all possible situations and put all possible explanations. That is the only idea of writing it this way. And I'm deliberately picking up these questions and training you so that you can learn, just notice that it's about creating a thing and then how do we elaborate upon it. So creating another 20 words on that. Alright. And then you can take two different things together. For example, you can draw two diagrams, one with parallel upward sloping supply and demand curves, and another with parallel downward sloping supply and demand curves. So there can be one upward sloping demand and supply curves parallel, one downward sloping demand and supply curves parallel, and then highlight that if the two curves are of the same slope and they are parallel to each other, again there will be no existence of equilibrium. Alright, so you can highlight here that if the two curves are of same slope and parallel, make it same direction of slope, and parallel to each other, then there is no equilibrium existent. If the two curves have the same direction of slope and they are parallel to each other, then there is no equilibrium existent. What I'm trying to teach you, and therefore I'm continuously highlighting it, is how do you create words while writing an answer where you just might feel 150 words is a little too much. Alright, so see, we have created 75 words just explaining the different cases. Alright, so that is what you got to do. Explain the different cases, create the words. How do you reduce words? Similarly, in some situations, reduce the explanation. Draw the diagram, write in one line, this is the meaning. So explanations decide whether the words get created or the words get reduced. Alright, so focus on that part only. That will be sufficient for us. So that is another that we talk about. Then if we take it further, so this is about minimum willingness to sell, the two curves being parallel. So there are three situations we have created where there may not exist an equilibrium, highlighting that if the demand and supply curves intersect, there will exist an equilibrium. After you have done it till here, then what you should do is you should talk about the point that equilibrium can exist and it is unique only if demand and supply curves intersect each other at only one point. The equilibrium can exist and it can be unique only if demand and supply curves can intersect each other at only one point. Then only it is unique. अगर demand और supply curve सिर्फ एक ही जगह पे खुद को intersect करें तो ही equilibrium unique होगा. So you will start explaining that. You will write below that the uniqueness of equilibrium is defined by singular point of intersection between demand and supply curves. The uniqueness of equilibrium is defined by singular point of intersection between demand and supply curves. And again what you can do is you can show that there is a singular point of intersection. You can again take a standard demand and supply curve. You don't have to necessarily explain a lot of it. What you simply have to do is, I'm so sorry. What you simply have to do is, you take quantity and you take price, draw a normal demand and supply curve, show this point E, and you can highlight that E is the only point of intersection between demand and supply curves if both the curves are linear if both the curves are linear and equilibrium exists, then it will be unique. If both the curves are linear and equilibrium exists, then it will be unique. Remember, it is not possible for two straight lines to intersect each other at two different points. I mean, if they are intersecting each other, that is. So if both the curves are linear and equilibrium exists, then it will be unique. Given, in the same thing you can write, given that one is downward sloping, generally the demand curve, and other is upward sloping. So that is the other thing that we create, that one is downward sloping and other is upward sloping. If that happens, then again we can claim that there is a unique and equilibrium that exists and an equilibrium that is unique. There is an equilibrium that exists and an equilibrium that is unique. Alright, that is what we get around here. So this is first of all introducing the idea of uniqueness. And again I repeat, if the curves are, so why did I write the last line? I wrote the last line because if the curves are linear and they are moving in same direction, like say both are upward sloping and both are downward sloping, and if they have the same slope and same intercept, then you will have multiple equilibria. You understand that? If demand curve and supply curve both are upward sloping or both are downward sloping and they are moving with same intercept and same slope, that will mean they are completely over each other, and that will represent multiple equilibria. Alright, that is why I wrote the last line saying that given that one is downward sloping and the other is upward sloping. Alright, that is covering for the specific situation that both can be downward sloping or both can be upward sloping and both can then be converging with, both can then be overlapping with each other. Alright, that is what we are ruling out, that cannot happen. Then, yes. Alright. This reminds me of one incident that when I was teaching at Delhi school, this had happened. That somebody's mobile had, had again buzzed off during one of the classes that a very senior professor was taking. He's called Mr. B.L. Pandit sir. And he's a very stocky person, tall and hefty. And, he looked at that fellow and said, meet me after the class. And this person was very scared that sir is now asking me to meet. And we were one of those younger teachers with whom the students interact more freely. So before meeting sir, he comes to our room. I was there and there is another very good professor there. He's called Dr. Abhijit Banerjee. Now sir is of course among the older professors. But in those days he used to be the youngsters. So I'm talking around 20 years back. So he came to us, we were talking and he said, sir, BLP sir has called me. God knows what will happen. It was just a mistake, I don't know. And we said, look, right now nothing can be done. You go off, talk to sir, whatever he says, let us know, and then we will see if we can help you. But right now what do we do? I mean, if something has happened and sir is so senior, we can't do much. And BLP sir has been teaching since we guys were at Delhi school, even when Abhijit sir was at Delhi school. Now this fellow goes to BLP sir's room, and sir tells him, pass on that ringtone to me. अभी आपका जो बज रहा था मुझे ऐसी ही फीलिंग हो रही थी तो मैं भी कहीं कुछ बीच में बजा के कुछ लोग मुझे बहुत दुखी करते हैं उटपटांग बातें बोलते हैं मैं भी सोच रहा हूँ मेरा प्रोटेस्ट का यही तरीका होगा यही बजा दूंगा चू चू बजता रहेगा मैं बोलूँगा पता नहीं कहाँ से आवाज आ रही है ऑलराइट answering your question, you know what can happen? If it is not linear, then it is possible that the curve can become backward bending. No, we are saying one is upward sloping, one is downward sloping. Unless it is not linear, I repeat again, the slopes are with respect to, like, nobody claims this is anywhere downward sloping. You see that? But you can very well have a supply curve, and this can be demand curve in an asymmetric information with respect to quality, and you can very well have 2 points of equilibrium. Alright, so that is why we are ruling that out. That if it is parabolic and still upward sloping, then let's make sure that we don't do that technical error in this. Yes, yes. That is uniqueness. You know, what the uniqueness here? Definitely. The linear and of opposite direction, then at one point. If it is not linear, if it is rectangular hyperbolic, if it is parabolic, then it is possible that it is upward sloping or it is downward sloping and might still intersect at more than one point. That is possible. That is possible. It is unique still. It can be, both can be non-linear. One can be like this, another can be like this. In linear, no. In linear case, it is certain that if you have an upward sloping demand, supply and downward sloping demand, and if they are intersecting, there cannot by any means be any other point of intersection. In a non-linear case, this can happen some other point of time. You understand that? So the possibilities are tremendous. But we are just putting the linearity part for that. All right. Yes. Possible, they can intersect at one point, but that we have kind of covered with uniqueness part. All right, like that part we covered, existence part. That if it exists and linearity, so it can be upward sloping, both of them, or downward sloping, both of them. My point is, see, what I'm trying to rule out by this is, your statement becomes a false even if there is one exception to it. I am trying to rule out that even one exception with the last line I am writing. It is not necessary that all upward sloping demand and supply curves will always be cotangent to each other. But there is a possibility, one of it. And that one possibility in the absence of this last sentence will make the sentence false. You understand that? आप अपने लैंग्वेज को लेकर हमेशा कॉन्शियस रहना. एक बार एक हस्बैंड ने अपना वाइफ को मैसेज किया. उनको मैसेज करके पूछे कैसा है सर दर्द. घर लौटे शाम को. द वाइफ वॉज वेरी एंग्री. दरवाजा बंद कर दिया. बोले क्या हुआ? घुसने नहीं दिया. मारपीट पे बात उतर आई. अब वो ऑटो करेक्ट ने उसको कर दिया था कैसी हो सर दर्द. तो इसीलिए यू गॉट टू बी केयरफुल कि आप लैंग्वेज लेके बहुत तैयार रहे, कहीं भी कुछ ऐसा ना हो कि ऑटो करेक्ट भी उसको खराब कर सके. So always be very careful about what you write, what you do. So remember, and हमारे सब्जेक्ट में तो बहुत ज़्यादा, because the professors who will correct your papers are professors who are trained in these things, so they know that there are exceptions which lie. So those exceptions which lie, you got to be conscious that you are ruling them out. So I'm never saying it's a possibility that you can have an equilibrium like this. It's a possibility you can have an equilibrium like this. So both downward sloping, both upward sloping can have equilibrium. I am ruling out this possibility or this possibility. That what if demand curve and supply curve overlap each other and both are upward sloping? What if demand curve and supply curve overlap each other and both are downward sloping? Now that becomes a possibility if I don't write this last line. You understand that? That is the only part that I was trying to rule out in this. Now see, you write below this, after having written this, what you will do is, you will write, it is possible that equilibrium is existing, it is possible that equilibrium is existing but not unique, in specific cases, when there are multiple points of intersection. For example, in case of backward bending labor supply curve, and downward sloping labor demand curve, backward bending labor supply curve and downward sloping labor demand curve, it is possible that equilibrium is not unique, as shown by points E1 and E2. If you explain existence and uniqueness together, Akanksha, the examiner can feel confused, and we can't risk that. So be careful there. All right, you write below that it can also happen in case of asymmetric information. It can also happen in case of asymmetric information where demand curve drawn with respect to quality, is upward sloping up to a point and then becomes backward bending then it is possible to have 2 points. of equilibrium represented by E1 and E2. It is possible to have 2 points of equilibrium represented by E1 and E2. Now, I'll just take a second. Now, when I'll teach you asymmetric information, I will explain this demand curve better to you. It will be a little premature if I do that right now. But remember this, in an asymmetric information, what happens is that the buyers don't have an idea about the quality of the product as good as what the sellers have it. Alright, जब एक asymmetric market होता है, तो buyers को इतने अच्छे से पता नहीं होता product के बारे में, जितने अच्छे से sellers को होता है. तो buyers quality को लेके guess work करते हैं. तो उन्हें लगता है अगर quality अच्छी हो रही है तो price बढ़ता रहेगा, लेकिन एक समय के बाद वो price को trust करना छोड़ देते हैं. उन्हें लगता है अगर price बढ़ भी रहा है तो possible है हमें खराब quality दी जा रही है. Alright, after a point the buyers can feel that maybe the quality is degrading, but the market is charging me a higher price just to convince me that the quality is good. And in that case, the buyers have this kind of a demand curve. The supply curve is as usual, that if you have to create a good quality, you need to charge a higher price. So supply curve is the usual supply curve. And again, the equilibrium in this market can again be at the 2 possible points of intersection, depending on where have you placed the market. The moral of the story here is that if they ask us anything on uniqueness, anything on existence, it's always good that we talk about what kind of market we are talking of. Also remember, one of your friend asks me that if demand and supply don't intersect, how will the price be determined? There is no requirement of price to be determined, that market won't exist. Alright, price determination का कोई सवाल ही नहीं है, market ही नहीं रहेगा. अगर demand curve और supply curve intersect नहीं करते, कोई equilibrium नहीं है, ऐसी commodity produce ही नहीं होगी. Alright, the market will not exist for such a commodity as demand and supply curves don't exist. So that is the point also to keep in mind in this. Also remember, when you talk about uniqueness, existence, the whole point is to challenge the thing that it is not necessary that uniqueness will imply existence or existence will imply uniqueness. Alright. If it is unique, then there exists an equilibrium. But if there exists an equilibrium, it is not necessary that it has to be unique. Alright, when you say the equilibrium is unique, so certainly कोई तो equilibrium होगा, तभी वो unique है. So if there is uniqueness, then there must exist an equilibrium. But if there is an equilibrium, it is not necessary that it will be unique. So existence doesn't necessarily mean that there will be uniqueness, but uniqueness means that there has to be an existence. Do I believe we are okay on that? You had a question. Will be there difference between? So see, you can always create X number of cases. So if you exchange demand and supply, then in that case, and say that supply curve is downward sloping and demand curve is upward sloping, still there will be no equilibrium. They got to intersect for them to have an equilibrium. Similarly, one of your friends has asked me online, what if the two curves are horizontal? Well, if the two curves are horizontal, this is one possibility, supply above demand. This is another possibility, demand above supply. And this is the third possibility where they coincide. You understand that? So there can be, see, if you bring up the cases, there can be n possible cases that we can create. That okay, what all can be done. Similarly, I can take up a case with a vertical supply and demand. Alright, that one can be to the left, another can be to the right, and then one can coincide, and so on. Alright, so don't worry, there can be multiple cases made, and there can be a situation where you can have this as demand and this as supply, but you still don't have an equilibrium. You understand that? That's because again they are not intersecting. Maybe then this good has to be sold as an infinitely higher priced good, and then the bargaining power between the producer and the consumer comes into picture. So all that converges. The basic idea right now that I want you to register is that we have to talk A, equilibrium, and B, uniqueness. All right, that is the idea, that yeah, existence and uniqueness. What are the rules for an equilibrium to exist? And we said that the basic rule for an equilibrium to exist is they should have intersection points between demand curve and supply curve. And what is the rule for uniqueness? The intersection point should be singular. If there are multiple points, then the demand and supply curves are giving you multiple equilibria. I deliberately made you write labor supply curve and all those points. Because unless you don't write the labor supply curve and mark it with asymmetric information, you will not be able to convince the examiner that you know in what circumstances does this take place. I hope you got your answer, Himanshu, on demand and supply curve is interchanged per se. Even if you change the upward and downward slope, the interpretation remains same. So don't worry. It's about different types of commodities where it can happen. I'll just take a second. Linear means which has a straight line shape. Non-linear can be parabola or hyperbola also. And equilibrium condition is a must for market existence. Yes, Rishabh. अगर equilibrium है, आप ये समझ लेना, अगर equilibrium है, unique भी है, तो exist तो कर रहा है वो. अगर equilibrium नहीं है, तो फिर exist ही नहीं कर रहा, तो uniqueness या multiple का कोई चर्चा ही नहीं हो सकती. Alright, if equilibrium doesn't exist, no question of uniqueness or multiple equilibrium. But if equilibrium exists, at least there will be a unique equilibria, and it is not necessary that that equilibrium has to be unique. Alright, that is the aspect of it. I can take it one by one. I had a hand raised. नहीं अभी आगे पढ़ोगे, ये चीज़ें आगे पढ़ोगे. जो तुम्हारे दोस्त इकोनॉमिक्स बैकग्राउंड के हैं वो ये सब पढ़े हुए हैं, तो उनको पता रहता है, तुम्हें भी पता चल जाएगा जैसे मैं यहाँ तक पहुँचूंगा और ये सारे टॉपिक्स पढ़ेंगे ये सब, तो ये आइडिया लग जाएगा कि ये बातें हैं. ठीक है. यस यस. Yeah, when the two curves overlap, then they coincide with each other, you have multiple equilibria. In fact, I could have shown it as that if suppose there is one demand curve like this and a supply curve like this, again there is multiple equilibria. So the market can choose one of those multiple points. It's indeterminate. Like market can choose any one. It's like having an indifference curve of perfect substitutes coinciding with the budget line. Now you have multiple equilibria, and you can choose any one of those points per se. All right. Yes. Yes. Yes, but this is all static market. So if it's a static market, you always look at demand and supply at a point of time. All right. If it was a dynamic market, then you would always think about how things will change over a period of time. And then we bring up the price expectations and the roles that can be played. That is the aspect in it. Yes, yes. Not the concern here, but they can always relate it to stability and instability, and we will judge it the same way. The way we were judging it yesterday, they can bring up the talks on stability and instability, and we will have to judge it in the same manner, the way we were judging it yesterday. All right, on uniqueness and so on. Also remember, these are nice commodities and a competitive market and all things we are discussing. Real world, you can be looking at demand and supply curve for various activities. You can be looking at demand and supply curves with respect to environmental puzzles that we face, that there can be demand for carbon, supply of carbon, all those carbon sinks, carbon trading and all that we discuss. You can be looking at demand and supply curves for multiple market possibilities, that if in one market something is there and then in the other market it is there or not. So with a real world in your mind, remember, there can be multiple possibilities of demand and supply curves. The objective of studying these theories is to assure that we can have some application of these theories, in different scenarios that can arise. That is why I was telling you yesterday in yesterday in the talk, that micro will be a unique situation always. So in micro, all possibilities are taken because we don't know what situation will be in what way. So that is why this kind of talk starts. if it is a generalized situation, life is still easy, that okay, this is what will happen. But in microeconomics, since it is about individuals and since it's about people, तो जब भी माइक्रो पढ़ते हो तो लोगों की इंडिविजुअल्स की बात हो रही है, इंडिविजुअल के इनकम की बात हो रही है, उनके प्राइस चार्ज की बात हो रही है. तो उस केस में ये कहना मुश्किल हो जाता है कि कौन सा डिमांड कर्व रह सकता है, नहीं रह सकता. हम सबके अपने अपने प्रेफरेंसेस हो सकते हैं, अपने मेथड्स हो सकते हैं. So that is why all possible conditions are covered in micro. Alright, that since everybody can have their own conditions, so we try covering all those possible conditions. Nothing else. There is no other reason for it. And also remember, in all this discussion, we are assuming that there exists a perfect competition. Alright, इस पूरे discussion में ये assumption है कि perfectly competitive market है. Nothing more, nothing less. Alright, now I take you into the next part. So from your exams point of view, if you have understood this much, it's good enough. Yeah, you are right, Abhishek. Vice versa, if the market exists, then equilibrium exists, may or may not happen, Manjushri. So please remember, equilibrium exists, then market exists, of course, but market can exist, but equilibrium may not exist. Yes, it's because of the leisure and work hours. That is why. Labor supply curve is backward bending for reasons. Sandhya, I will be discussing it with you. That why is it backward bending? Yes, demand and supply curve can exist in negative quadrants provided somebody is willing to pay to supply things. For example, initially in many markets, people give you incentives to buy their product. Sometimes they may be giving you incentives large enough so that you buy their product, even if they are giving you something extra. Now that's about supply curve in the negative quadrant at times. Very often you will see supply curves, very often in fact, in economics, supply curve going like this, where my minimum willingness to sell can be in the negative zone. Alright, so that is about the supply curve in the negative quadrant. Demand curve in the negative quadrant is difficult to find, but not impossible. There are situations when demand curve can go into negative quadrant, suggesting my unwillingness to buy actually. It's like if I have a demand function, just giving you a random idea, but since one of your friends has asked this question, if I have a demand curve as Q is equal to 10 minus P, now in that case, if I put P is equal to 0, Q is equal to 10, but now if I take any Q higher than 10, then P starts becoming negative. So I can always think about this, that if the consumer says that if you want to sell me anything more than 10, you will have to kind of give me some subsidy, or you will have to kind of give me some extra help, and then only I'm willing to purchase that. In fact, that is the reason that suppose if this is a merit commodity, something good for the people, you want people to consume more than 10 units of it, say you want people to consume 20 units of it, it's possible you can give them a subsidy which shifts their supply demand curve like this, and they may end up consuming up to 20 units, giving the commodity for free to them. Do I believe I reach you on that? तो ये जो पॉलिसीज बनती हैं वो इन्हीं चीज़ों के ऊपर बनती हैं. द डिमांड कर्व कैन बी डाउनवर्ड स्लोपिंग, सप्लाई कर्व कैन बी अ नेगेटिव क्वाड्रेंट, सप्लाई कर्व कैन हैव अ नेगेटिव क्वाड्रेंट. देयर इज नो प्रॉब्लम with that at all. All right. It's also possible that both can have a negative quadrant and both can intersect in a negative quadrant. That is where we say that equilibrium doesn't exist in the normal domain. Again, you need policy intervention. All right. So these are theories given by people to suggest what can be possible situations in which policy intervention might be needed. अब ये मार्केट तो एग्जिस्ट ही नहीं करेगा बिकॉज इक्विलिब्रियम तो जो है वो नेगेटिव क्वाड्रेंट में है, so this market will not exist. But what happens is in this case that sometimes the government can give some subsidy such that the demand curve can be lifted like this and you may have some equilibrium here, or the supply curve can get shifted like this, you may have some equilibrium here. Let me teach you public economics. And in public finance, we will be doing some models like these where the subsidy can be given. Easiest example I can give you is when people give you a midday meal and a free education and a free uniform, and then also along with that, the government also gives people sometimes scholarship to come and study in the school, like say a Ladli Yojana that the Delhi government runs. Why do they do these yojanas? What is the purpose? They say that we incentivize you in various ways, otherwise maybe the demand for education is in the negative quadrant. They give me something so I can come and get educated, otherwise I'm not coming. So in that case, all promises are made that तुम्हें खाना भी देंगे, तुम्हें यूनिफॉर्म भी देंगे, तुम आओ तुमको पैसा भी देंगे, पर आके पढ़ लो यहाँ पे। तो आप डिमांड क्रिएट कर रहे हो लोगों को पैसे देकर, तो ये डिमांड कब नेगेटिव क्वाड्रेंट में है, नहीं इंटरसेक्ट कर रहा। वैसे ही अगर आप प्राइवेट सेक्टर को बोलोगे सप्लाई करो, हो सकता है अगर एक रिमोट एरिया है, विलेज है, प्राइवेट सेक्टर बोलते हैं मुझे नहीं इच्छा है इसको सप्लाई करने की, तो फिर आपको सरकार से सप्लाई कराना पड़ता है, सो दैट देयर इज अ मार्केट फॉर दैट। सो रिमेंबर, different markets have their own different provisions, and that can create possibly all things around for you. Now when we, yes, no, that is again depending on which startup are we talking about. For example, if you take edutech companies, say an academy or a etc, prep ladder and whatnot. Now these edutech companies at the moment are supplying things at a very cheaper rate because of investors' money. Now that's quite an interesting thing, that you use investors' money to meet your cost and then supply it cheap to the consumers. Now the consumers lap it up to you because you are cheap, I mean the price, so then consumers lap it up to you because you are cheap, and then you are telling your investors, and I can't understand how the investors are believing it, but you are telling your investors that this volume will get me revenue one day sufficient enough to meet my cost when you go away. But how will that happen? I'm using your money to finance my expenditure today, and therefore charging it less. Now my valuation will be done proper if I charge more and then check how many are willing to see me. अभी अगर मैं फ्री में YouTube पे लेक्चर बोलने लगूं तो जिनको इकोनॉमिक्स नहीं आती वो भी चले आएंगे देखने 5 मिनट के लिए, देखें क्या बोलते हैं, टोन ठीक है या नहीं इनकी। उनको हो सकता है इकोनॉमिक्स से कोई मतलब ना हो, कैसा दिखते हैं, क्या हुआ है, कौन बोल रहे हैं, अच्छा सुना था कोई विभास सर है, ऐसे कोई बात हो सकती है, या चलो ऐसे ही बातचीत कर लेते हैं आपस में हम उनके। तो मैं अगर अपना व्यूज देख के सोचूंगा, इट्स पॉसिबल दैट माई लेक्चर बिकम्स अ मेथड बाय विच 2 people are chatting among each other, and they're connected on my lecture, and they're doing that. So if I value myself based on that lecture, that's not a correct valuation. So better valuation is I put some money on that and then check my valuation and I try recovering that money from my own sources. Right now, how do these edutech companies are working, or for that matter most of the tech companies, but since we guys are in education right now we can maybe pick them up. So how are they working? A method of their working is that they are saying, okay, investors have put in a lot of money into them, so they are meeting their expenditure through the investors' money and they are not passing on the price to the buyers. But how long does this model continue? So the price will have to be passed on to the buyers one day. And then the larger question arises, are the buyers willing to pay that price for the quality you are serving? And if the buyers are not willing to pay the price for the quality you are serving, what is your business model? How will you be earning profit in future? What will be the methodology regarding that? So if you, I hope I am proven wrong. Normally I get proven right on these things. But India has a big bubble in unicorns right now. A huge bubble is what my research says. That we are overvaluing many companies in the expectations that they will pick up. Maybe the foreign investors don't realize the volume of people we have. So they are maybe impressed sheer volume of views that the streaming is getting. But we should not be impressed by sheer volume of views because we have too many people in our country. So those volume of views will come. That is the basic aspect of it. So that is why I told you that you start anything across and you can be even, and just give it for free. And I'm not saying it's a bad content, so please don't misunderstand me. I'm saying that the real test of the content is when you put the market price to it. It can be an average content. I can give you an average content for an average price or a below average price. You will always lap it up. That's demand supply. मुझे बोलो फिजिक्स पढ़ाने को, मैं फ्री में पढ़ा दूंगा क्योंकि मेरे एक्सपेरिमेंट तो आप ही लोग होगे ना, आती है नहीं मुझे. So if I don't know, I will experiment on you, teach it, and I will say I'm teaching for free. People can come in. So that is where if you ask me, the new startups have to understand what is the demand supply side. On YouTube, I have seen many people trying to teach. अब एक बात सोचो, अच्छा पढ़ाते हैं मतलब क्या है? मुझे उनकी सब बात समझ आ रही थी, आपको समझ आ रही थी, लेकिन वो बात आएगी या नहीं पेपर में, ये जरूरी है ना. मैं बोलूं ABCD, समझ आएगी तुम्हें? If I say 1 + 2 = 3, you will get me. If I say these are the basic fundamental rights, you will get me. But important question is, will those things come in my answer sheet or test paper? And if those things don't come in the test paper, then what is the fun in understanding it? You understand that? लेकिन हम लोग कभी कभी कहते हैं अच्छा पढ़ा रहे थे, सब बात समझ आ रही थी. समझ तो आ ही जाएगी, क्योंकि हो सकता है वो पढ़ा रहे हो जो आता नहीं है लेकिन है आसान. वो तो गड़बड़ बात है ना. I got to live it up to the point where I also teach you things that come in the paper, help you in the examination for which you are preparing. That is the real test, that whether you are getting that or not. For example, Indian economy or anything, when I'm teaching you Indian economy, if you have not yet learnt interlinkages, my job is to teach you interlinkages. Because when you say, oh, Indian economy, I can answer it. Indian economy, I understood it. No, you didn't, actually. And sometimes when I read your answers, it tells me that you haven't fully as yet, but I'm patient because I know that it's okay. They are new days, and gradually you would understand. Indian economy is in across. I mean, I believe Indian economy in general, but Indian economy, at least for UPSC, is unlike what we used to do till our college days. Till our college days, we would write answers picking words. Critically analyze if the impact of industrial changes in India after 1991 on service-led growth in India. Industrial changes, service-led growth after 91. Ab tu bhugat. Sab dete hain tujhe. That's not how you have to answer in this examination. And that's my job, of course, to train you in that. But even Indian economy, sometimes you feel, oh, मेरे समझ आ रहा है सब कुछ. समझ आ रहा है या नहीं, वो तो जब क्वेश्चंस पूछते हैं वो और थोड़ा सा भी घुमा देते हैं तो पता चलता है कि समझ आया या नहीं. समझने का मतलब होता है मुझसे कुछ भी पूछो, किसी भी एंगल से पूछो, मैं जवाब दे दूंगा. उसे कहते हैं समझ आना. But we feel, oh, I have got what sir said. You might get what I tell you, but unless you don't think on it a little more, you may not get what exactly is the whole crux of the thing. And sometimes the mental complacency hits you badly. Because while doing Indian economy or while doing something which looks relatively simple, there is a mental complacency. Oh yeah, I'm getting it. I'll write. You know why? Because you feel you will write something on it. You write something on it, you will get some marks on it. You won't get good marks then. कोई बात है यूपीएससी में ना कि 250 नंबर के जीएस के पेपर में 110 नंबर लाना भी आफत रहता है. आपके 250 मार्क्स के ऑप्शनल के पेपर में 120 लाने वाले अच्छा परफॉर्मर कहलाते हैं. अब लेकिन आते 170 भी हैं. It's not that 170 is not given. So you can't give an excuse, look, these marks just don't get scored. They get scored, everybody is not getting it. So those who are getting it are doing something different due to which they are getting it. So the herd behavior is this. Herd behavior is go ahead and do things and okay, I got it and I easily pursued it. तो ये बात समझा रहा हूँ बस तुम्हें कि ये सारी चीजें जो ये वैल्यूएशन से रिलेटेड है, इसलिए मैं इधर आ गया था कि ये वैल्यूएशन से रिलेटेड है कि तुम अपने एनालिसिस कैसे कर पाते हो, दिमाग चलाते कैसे हो. अब मैंने तुम्हें ये सब समझाया, यूनिकनेस, एग्जिस्टेंस, fair enough. They may not ask you this over here and they may put a question based on uniqueness and existence or only uniqueness involving something related to international economics, something related to public economics. Why do you think I took up the question of your friend online when I was asked that can demand and supply curves intersect in the negative quadrant? Who knows, tomorrow this question can be in the UPSC paper. Because it's not impossible to happen. It's a possibility that demand and supply curves can intersect in the negative quadrant. Negative quantity quadrant, that is. Now what do? You can't tell them, no, how do you expect me to think like this? They expect you to think anything once you have done a topic. So that is why I go ahead and do cases with you, so that you also start understanding, okay, this is a case and this is how it should be implemented. I'm not complaining at all. I'm pretty happy with the way batch is shaping up, and I'm very happy with the efforts you guys are making, especially with all the answers also that you are writing and all. But I'm just telling you one thing. You know what is your one, there are two enemies of yours in this examination preparation. One is inconsistency. Good 5 days and not so good next 5 days, and average becomes average. So that's one big enemy of yours in this examination preparation. And the second enemy is when you lose interest just because you believe it's work and not leisure. कोई डिस्कशन चल रहा है, आप अपना इंटरेस्ट लूज कर दिए. क्या सोच रहे हो, क्या करना है लाइफ में? तो क्यों इंटरेस्ट लूज कर जाओगे अगर कोई डिस्कशन चल रहा है तो? जैसे मान लो मैं एक डिस्कशन कर रहा हूँ एग्रीकल्चर पे, या आपसे डिस्कशन कर रहा हूँ यूनिकनेस पे, जैसे अभी मैंने मान लो ड्रॉ कर दिया और फोर्थ क्वाड्रेंट में इक्विलिब्रियम। अब यही चीज अगर मैं क्वेश्चन लिख के करता, इफ देयर इज अ पॉसिबिलिटी ऑफ अ क्वेश्चन सी दिस, तो अचानक तुम्हारा दिमाग जग जाता है। फोर्थ क्वाड्रेंट में इक्विलिब्रियम, अरे सर ने एक नई बात कराई। डिस्कशन करते हुए मैंने कह दिया दैट इट्स पॉसिबल थिंग्स कैन बी हियर एंड थिंग्स कैन बी हियर, एंड देन somebody got to give extra demand. If the mind sleeps off in that, then these are those missing links from the exam's point of view. Everybody's question is your question. Treat it like that. Everybody's answer is your answer. That is called remaining 100% involved. It's tiring, no doubt about it. It's tiring, it's not very enervating, but be with it. Unless you don't do that, the troubles continue. This exam tests you exactly on that. You know, जब वो आप पढ़ते हो ना, जो डायलॉग बाजी होती है, you should eat, sleep, drink UPSC. You should eat, sleep, drink your work, whatever you are doing. Sometimes you would be getting my replies early hours in the morning. Sometimes you get it late in the night. I'll tell you, sometimes I give you a reply when I've woken up from my sleep. Now I'm not feeling sleepy. I pick up my phone, some doubt, I answer it, go back to sleep. You know, sometimes it can be 2:30 in the morning. It doesn't mean I'm necessarily awake at 2:30. I might have slept at my normal 12:15, and I wake up at around 5:30, 5:45. But I might wake up in between, and I'm not feeling very sleepy. I'll answer, go off to sleep. There is no harm in doing that. तुम्हें अगर नींद नहीं आ रही है, या यहाँ मान लो मैं 5 मिनट भी है मेरे, तुम एक आंसर फ्रेम कर लो अपने दिमाग में. That is called eating, sleeping, drinking the work. अगर उसी को कुछ कहते हैं तो. But if you are not that much involved, then how do you get what you would like to get? Your involvement has to be complete. You know, तो वो जब तुम्हें कुछ भी याद ना रहे, ऐसे ही तुमसे शेयर कर रहा हूँ, but you know, once while doing my PhD, क्योंकि मैं जब यूएस में था तो मोबाइल फोन्स एंड ऑल तो थे नहीं, I had forgotten my birthday. Because that was the involvement. I didn't remember it's 12 January. मुझे लगा अच्छा बीत गया. वो तो जब अगले दिन मदर का कार्ड आया तो मुझे लगा अच्छा मेरा बर्थडे बीत गया. तो ये बस कह रहा हूँ कि अपनी इन्वॉल्वमेंट को रखो. ये जो डिस्कशंस हैं, जरूरी नहीं यूपीएससी लगातार पूछे, पर जरूरी ये भी नहीं कि नहीं पूछे. तो हमें खबर होनी चाहिए कि क्या हो सकता है. अगर बोर्ड पे सर कुछ कर रहे हैं, टाइम पास तो करूंगा नहीं तुम्हारे साथ, ये पक्की बात है. सो इफ आई पिक अप अ क्वेश्चन एंड डू समथिंग ऑन द बोर्ड, इट्स डेलिबरेट बिकॉज there can be various facets of what can happen possibly in any particular set of questions. So that is why. Now I take you further into a cobweb model discussion. Yes. No, in real goods, this is all real market only. It is not a financial market. There will be existence and uniqueness. Both curves are fair enough. You will still have multiple equilibrium. All right, not a problem on that. Non-linear and coinciding, you will still have multiple equilibrium. The demand curve and supply curve touch y-axis, showing the reservation price on that, Anusha. The place where demand curve exists, touches the y-axis is the maximum willingness to pay, and the place where demand supply curve touches it is the minimum willingness to charge by the producer. If a market doesn't have an equilibrium, where will stability come in, Akanksha? Think of it. There is no question of stability. No, Jio was a different model, Shubham. Jio was giving it for free because they were like distributing your initial samples, and then they started pricing it. Don't forget that. So Jio is a very different thing from edtech companies. Jio did not have as much competition as what these guys have, and quality is again a concern. So Jio had a 4G already with itself. No, Vigneshwaran, you send me this question on the message, and I will be giving you an answer to this. No, Raghav, it's not about MC getting reduced actually. All right, with heavy fixed cost, the AFC gets reduced with production. Okay. Now see, you take a heading, you write cobweb model. In this, there are basic assumptions. One, market has perfect competition market has perfect competition. Second, demand is affected by price prevailing in current time period T and supply is affected by price prevailing in previous time period T minus 1. Demand is affected by price prevailing in current time period T and supply is affected by price prevailing in previous time period T minus 1. And both demand and supply are linear curves. So they are linear forms. Both demand and supply are linear. These are the assumptions of negative output. कैसे बेचोगे बताओ? Answering your question, कृष्ण कुमार, negative quadrant में market exist क्यों नहीं करता? Negative output कैसे खरीद के लाओगे? ये सोच के देखो. You can always see it again in the video, Rizwana. Because if I go back to it, it will be a little bad for all those who were listening to me when I was talking on that dimension. All right. Now see, this cobweb model is majorly used in agriculture because the farmers sow the crop looking at the price today, but the crop will be harvested in the next time period and sold then. For example, I can see the paddy price today and then decide to sow the paddy in the next time period. And the consumers will pay in the market based on the price that they observe immediately in the market. So it's like quantity demanded is a function of price in time t and quantity supplied is a function of price in t minus 1. Alright, quantity demanded is a function of price in time t and quantity supplied is a function of price in time t minus 1. Now see, when I can get rid of these. When we talk about a cobweb model, cobweb का मतलब होता है वो मकड़े की जाली, ठीक है, उसको कहते हैं cobweb. तो ये मॉडल वैसा ही इक्विलिब्रियम दिखाता है, इसीलिए इसका नाम दिया cobweb model. Since it looks like a cobweb, the spider's web, therefore it is called a cobweb model. So let's see how that works out. See, if we take quantity and price, and let us say we have a supply curve and a demand curve. Now imagine if suppose this is the price P1. You keep listening to me and we will then gradually draw it up. Write it down. So suppose this is a price P1. So you have a demand D1 and supply S1 at price P1. So you think like this. आप अपने दिमाग को ऐसे चलाओ. आप अपने दिमाग को चलाओ ये सोचकर कि मान लो एक टाइम पीरियड था 0. Alright, you think like this. That suppose there was a time period 0 and the price observed in time period 0 was P1. प्रोड्यूसर को नजर आया कि टाइम पीरियड 0 में प्राइस है P1. तो अगले टाइम पीरियड में उनके हिसाब से प्राइस रहेगा P1. Alright, the producer observes that there is a time period price P1. So next time period, the producer thinks, okay, the price will be P1. And thinking that the price will be P1, the producer produces S1, but the demand in the market then becomes D1. All right, now this is excess supply in the market. Looking at price P1, the producer produces S1, and the demand in the market remains D1. So the producer contemplates, producer ये सोचते हैं that what should I do so that I can exhaust all these quantities. Let's call it S1. प्रोड्यूसर के मन में आता है मैं कितना प्राइस चार्ज करूं जिससे कि ये S1 पूरे का पूरा बिक जाए. हाउ मच प्राइस डू आई चार्ज सो दैट दिस इंटायर S1 गोज सोल्ड आउट. Producer gets the message from the market that actually consumers' willingness to pay is D2. You see that? That if producer wants to sell S1, then the consumers say, look, come and charge P2. ये demand curve यही बता रहा है ना. If the producers want to sell S1, then the consumers are saying, okay, then pay me this price. And if you charge this price, we are willing to buy all your S1. Now what happens? Producer says, all right. So it's a second time period. At the end of time period 1 now, producer visualizes a price, P2. At the end of time period 1, producer visualizes a price, P2. That okay, consumers were willing to pay P2 if I had to exhaust this S1. But when the producer visualizes the price P2, the producer doesn't sell the S1. The producer will now supply this S2. All right? When producer supplies this S2, what happens in the market? Excess supply or excess demand? Excess demand. At price P2, the producer is willing to supply S2, but the consumer is willing to buy D2. Again the producer asks himself a question. Producer फिर खुद से एक सवाल पूछते हैं, इस S2 को बेचने के लिए मुझे क्या प्राइस चार्ज करना चाहिए था? अगर मैं, क्योंकि अब उनको एक्सेस डिमांड दिख रहा है, तो कहते हैं अगर S2 बेचता मैं तो क्या प्राइस चार्ज करना चाहिए था? The producer thinks, if I have to sell S2, then what kind of price do I charge? So the producer will get something like this from the demand curve. Let us say D3 giving this price P3. So now the producer realizes, oh, acha, I could have charged a price P3 and I could have sold it in the market for P3 if I had to exhaust my commodity S2. But now when the price observed by the producer at the end of the second time period reaches P3, then the producer will end up supplying more and will supply this S3. Isn't it? Again, when the fellow supplies S3, it results in excess demand or excess supply. And that excess supply means, again the fellow feels, how much should I charge to sell this S3? Now you get this point D4. I'm not going to complicate it further, but just willing that you understand what is happening. And you know what happens? हाँ, वो धीरे धीरे ये ऐसे move करता हुआ finally यहाँ equilibrium में आ जाएगा. Alright, this will keep adjusting and finally reach an equilibrium. That every time period there is a hit and trial going on and finally it will reach an equilibrium. But remember, when I say finally it reaches an equilibrium, that is because I have deliberately played a trick here, which is I have drawn the supply curve inelastic and demand curve relatively elastic. मैंने demand curve को flat draw किया है, supply curve को थोड़ा steep, इसीलिए ये वापस equilibrium में आ रहा है. अगर मैंने ऐसा नहीं किया होता तो ये equilibrium में नहीं आता. अभी मैं वो भी show करूंगा आपको. If I hadn't done this, it wouldn't have come to equilibrium. Since I have drawn demand curve steep, flatter and supply curve steeper, you get it in equilibrium. Why? Why is that happening? Don't worry, I'm rubbing it off and I'll draw it all again. All right. मैं कुछ पढ़ा रहा हूं तुम मुझे कुछ क्यों पूछ रहे हो अब्दुल, ये बताओ. We are talking cobweb, why are you going into different time periods? धैर्य रखो अभी. बट अगर मैं कुछ पढ़ा रहा हूं तुम कुछ और सोचोगे ना तो मेरी बात पहुंचेगी नहीं तुम तक. मुझे बस वो डराता है. All right, so don't worry about the time period and Marshall's equilibrium in different time period. focus right now on cobweb entirely, Abdul. I hope I'm clear to you on that. And that's different, Himanshu. Don't go in that direction also. Subsidize, nudging, जाने दो, UPI, रुपए कार्ड सबको छोड़ दो अभी. माइक्रो में जैसे ही हम लोग ज्यादा सोचते हैं ना इधर उधर गड़बड़ कर देता है वो. Just stick to the theories again. So let us see this again. Let us try understanding this whole point again. It all starts like this. अब सब लोग ध्यान से सुनना मेरी बात. मैंने जानबूझ के क्या किया, एक डिमांड कर्व ड्रॉ किया जो थोड़ा फ्लैट है और एक सप्लाई कर्व ड्रॉ किया जो थोड़ा स्टीप है. देन आई पिक अ प्राइस which is above equilibrium P1. At this P1, this is the quantity demanded, this is the quantity supplied. All right, demand है D1 और supply है S1. नहीं 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 नहीं, ये लिखा मैंने. अच्छा, मतलब तुम पूछ रहे हो कि वॉलरस की तरह सॉल्यूशन हो रहा है. चलो ऐसा मान लेते हैं, ठीक है, ऐसा मान लेते हैं. बट एक्चुअली ये वॉलरस की तरह नहीं हो रहा, क्योंकि अगले स्टेप पे अगर जाओगे तो देखोगे कि फिर इस डिफरेंस को भी देखते हैं. तो प्योर वॉलरस तो हो नहीं रहा वो, है ना. तो इसीलिए वैसे नहीं सोचो तो बेहतर है. ठीक है, ऑल राइट. All static. This is the dynamic part now, because this is a t and t minus 1. This has an SS dependent on pt minus 1, and this is a dd dependent on pt. Now see and try understanding. मैं फिर से तुम्हें स्टोरी सुना रहा हूं और जो भी मैं इंग्लिश में बोल रहा हूं फिर से उसे हिंदी में रिपीट कर रहा हूं. Whatever I'm speaking in English, I'll again repeat it in Hindi. So in that case, don't get bothered that I'll miss in one language. But in case, there's one suggestion from my side for all of you who at times struggle in English. Get used to it. You know, language is just about getting used to it. Get used to it because you have chosen English as your language of appearing this exam. You know, so don't go away from it. उससे डरने की कोई ज़रूरत नहीं है. You don't have to get worried about English. But I will be repeating in all both the languages so that you can get full clarity. So, just starting my story again, we start at a point where the fellow gets a price P1. So the producer in a time period 0 say has observed a price P1. Based on that, the producer produces S1. एक ऐसा टाइम पीरियड 0 था जिसमें प्रोड्यूसर ने P1 प्राइस ऑब्जर्व किया और उस P1 प्राइस को ऑब्जर्व करके उन्होंने प्रोड्यूस किया S1. You okay on that? No, we are just starting at a point. I could have taken a point below the equilibrium. Then there is no cobweb development. I mean, think of it. You need to develop something. Imagine it like this. You need to develop a model to understand why there is a cobweb. Now, if you have to understand why there is a cobweb, how do you begin at equilibrium? You understand that? How will the producer know what the market is going to demand? How do you know which job finally you will land up at? With your expectations, you are appearing for UPSC exam, isn't it? Is that foolish or is that conjecture? You see that? Life is based on conjectures. Why aren't conjectures and probabilities define life? Always remember that. We are all sitting here assuming this will not fall, hence not padded and not wearing helmet. Understand this. It's all conjecture. कोई गारंटी थोड़ी है ये गिर नहीं सकता है. पर हम बैठे हुए हैं ये सोच कर कि नहीं ये तो नहीं होगा. प्रोबेबिलिटीज की 0.000000780 और काइंड ऑफ है कुछ 1. तो इसीलिए हम कहते हैं ठीक है, we don't have to do that. So remember always, when you talk about a producer looking at a price, it's not that the producer is choosing that price. The market shows that price to the producer. Now somewhere you got to begin, so I'm beginning at this point, but that doesn't mean that this is the only thing that has happened. You understand that? So that's why I told you that there is a time period T0 in which the producer sees this price in the market, all right? And looking at this price in the market, the producer supplies a commodity S1. एक टाइम पीरियड है T0 जिसमें प्रोड्यूसर को नजर आता है प्राइस P1 और उसको देखकर वो सप्लाई कर देते हैं S1. लेकिन उस वक्त मार्केट में डिमांड कितना है? D1. The demand at that time in the market is D1. Now the producer thinks, and this is important, understand this. Now the producer thinks, what do I do so that I can sell off all this output that I have produced? ठीक है, प्रोड्यूसर ये सोचते हैं क्या करूं मैं, क्या प्राइस चार्ज करूं जिससे कि ये जितना प्रोड्यूस किया है ये सब बिक जाए. So how will the producer get to know that? From the demand curve, because demand curve shows the willingness to pay. Demand curve ही बताता है ना willingness to pay. तो demand curve बताएगा कितना पैसे चार्ज करते तो सारा बिक जाता. You understand that? The thinking is that how much price I should have charged so that everything would have been sold out. So the producer gets to know that if they had charged a price P2, then she would have been able to sell off everything. If she had charged a price P2, she would have been able to sell off everything. Alright? ये जो S1 था, अगर उसे मार्केट में बेचना था, तो फिर प्रोड्यूसर के हिसाब से P2 प्राइस अगर होता, तो पूरा बिक जाता क्योंकि कंज्यूमर यही देने को तैयार है. कैसे पता हमें कंज्यूमर यही देने को तैयार है? वो डिमांड कर्व से पता चलता है कि इस S1 के लिए कंज्यूमर इतना पे करने को विलिंग है. Alright? So we know that the consumer is willing to pay this D2 looking at this demand curve for this S1 quantity. But now, when the next time period, say time period 2, the producer comes into the market and the producer has to produce, looking at a price P2, the producer will surely not be producing D2. Now the producer will produce S2. जब प्रोड्यूसर मार्केट में आते हैं अगले टाइम पीरियड में, टाइम पीरियड 2 में, तो उनको पता है प्राइस है P2. अगर उनको पता है प्राइस है P2, तो वो थोड़ी D2 सप्लाई करेंगे, वो तो S2 सप्लाई करेंगे. जैसे वो S2 सप्लाई करते हैं, as soon as the producer supplies S2, now there is an excess demand. Again प्रोड्यूसर देखना चाहते हैं क्या प्राइस में चार्ज कर लेता तो ये डिमांड पूरा सप्लाई मेरा कंप्लीट मार्केट को एग्जॉस्ट कर देता. द प्रोड्यूसर ट्राइज फाइंडिंग आउट व्हाट प्राइस डू आई चार्ज सो दैट सप्लाई एग्जॉस्ट द कंप्लीट exhausted completely by demand. Producer gets a message, S2 के लिए तो willingness to pay consumer का, अगर इसे बोलूं S2, तो consumer का willingness to pay है D3. Producer gets a message that consumer's willingness to pay for S2 is actually D3. Do I believe you are with me on this? All right. Now, if it is D3, the producer visualizes a price P3 at the end of time period 2. Time period 2 खत्म हुआ, प्रोड्यूसर को प्राइस दिख रहा है P3. अब प्रोड्यूसर कहते हैं P3 प्राइस पे अगर मुझे सेल करना है तब तो मैं सेल करूंगा S3. If it is at P3 price that I have to sell, then I will sell S3. Again it creates excess supply. And that means, again the producer feels, okay, to exhaust my S3, what price is the consumer willing to pay? And now the consumer is willing to pay this D4. And this whole story continues till you will reach an equilibrium finally like this. तो आपका इक्विलिब्रियम कैसे पहुंचता है देखो, आप यहां से शुरू किए, यहां आए, फिर इधर गए, यहां आए, इधर गए, यहां आए, ये ऐसी एडजस्टमेंट हो रही है ना. तो ये कॉबवेब जैसा लगता है, इसीलिए इसका नाम रखे कॉबवेब मॉडल. ऑलराइट, जो आपका इक्विलिब्रियम है, आई होप दिस ग्राफ इज क्लैरिफाइंग इट टू यू. योर इक्विलिब्रियम इज रीचिंग यू. सी, we started with a demand and supply curve, this, 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 and this goes on till I reach equilibrium finally at some point here. That is why the name Cobweb model. Alright, that is why the name Cobweb model. That, and again I repeat, the equilibrium comes into picture and you do have an equilibrium because producer's reaction to change in price is much lesser with respect to quantity than consumer's reaction. Try understanding this. We started here. This horizontal line tells us how much is the extra that the producer has supplied compared to what the consumer was willing to purchase. Now, since producer's elasticity is relatively low and consumer's elasticity is relatively high, price elasticity. So when producer tries finding out how much price fall is needed to this adjustment, P1 to P2, to sell the commodity, it is consumer side adjustment. What the producer is trying to find here is consumer side adjustment, how much reduction in price will be needed so that this is sold. This consumer side adjustment means price falls from P1 to P2. Now I need you to notice something here. When price falls from P1 to P2, that is good enough to make consumer demand this distance, this horizontal distance. But the reaction of producer in reducing the quantity is not this horizontal distance, but lesser than that. Same price change के लिए कंज्यूमर ज्यादा खरीदने को रेडी थे, लेकिन प्रोड्यूसर ने कम रिड्यूस किया अपनी क्वांटिटी क्योंकि सप्लाई इनइलास्टिक है. यू अंडरस्टैंड दैट? अगर सप्लाई इनइलास्टिक नहीं होता तो ये और ज्यादा बढ़ गया होता. Since supply is relatively inelastic to demand, price fall is same, P1, P2. This D1, S1 is whose adjustment? Consumers or producers? Consumers. You understand that? किसी के मन में prosumers नहीं आ रहा? सब लोग समझ रहे हैं मेरी बात? This got to be consumers. Consumers are saying, if you want me to buy this extra, reduce your price from P1 to P2. Now the producers reduce the price from P1 to P2. The quantity supplied falls, no doubt, but it doesn't fall by D1 S1 horizontal distance. It falls by a lesser distance D2 S2. Do I reach you on this? And that is the beginning of your cobweb reaching equilibrium. Because producer reduced the quantity, but by lesser than what the consumer was willing to buy. So now see what happens. Then the producer realizes there is an excess demand, raises the price. Again think, when the producer reduces the quantity this much, consumer's demand curve is elastic, that is price will respond lesser than quantity. Price will respond lesser than quantity. So producer ने इतना response किया था इस price पर ये quantity. उतनी ही quantity कम होने पर consumer का जो price response है वो वापस P1 पे नहीं जा रहा. P1 से नीचे रह गया. क्यों? क्योंकि कंज्यूमर का डिमांड इलास्टिक है. द प्रोड्यूसर रिस्पॉन्डेड टू फॉल P1 to P2 by reducing supply from D2 to S2. Now the consumer has to choose what price to pay. Consumer doesn't go back to P1 again. Consumer says, I'll pay a little higher price but lesser than P1. Why? Because demand is relatively more elastic. If demand is relatively more elastic, it means for a given change in quantity, price will change by a lesser value, no? Elastic का मतलब क्या होता है? For a given change in price, quantity changes by a larger value. So for a given change in quantity, price will change by a lesser value. So see, price changes by a lesser value. And again, it's the producer's turn to react. With a given price increase by consumer, the producer again changes this horizontal thing by a relatively lesser value. तो ये जो हॉरिजॉन्टल साइंस कम होते जा रहे हैं ना, वो इसलिए क्योंकि हर बार कंज्यूमर जितना रिस्पॉन्ड करते हैं क्वांटिटी में, प्रोड्यूसर सब क्वांटिटी में उससे कम रिस्पॉन्ड करते हैं. और हर बार प्रोड्यूसर जितना प्राइस में रिस्पॉन्ड करते हैं, कंज्यूमर उससे कम रिस्पॉन्ड करते हैं. सो दिस वर्टिकल डिस्टेंस गोज ऑन बिकमिंग शॉर्टर एंड दिस हॉरिजॉन्टल डिस्टेंस गोज ऑन बिकमिंग शॉर्टर टिल दे बिकम अ पॉइंट. डू आई बिलीव यू अंडरस्टैंड दैट? You will understand me better, don't worry. If it is even 50% right now, I am happy. You will understand me better as I draw another one, and I'll give you a write-up on all of this, so don't worry at all. But I need you to understand these things first. Imagine if I draw for you, अगर मैं कुछ draw करके दूं ऐसा कुछ आपको, supply curve elastic and demand curve inelastic. और अब वही story शुरू करते हैं. P1, D1, S1. तो प्रोड्यूसर को नजर आया that to sell this S1, the price has to be reduced to D2. Now think what happens. Consumer says, this much quantity adjustment if you want me to do, then reduce the price by a larger value because demand is now relatively inelastic. You understand that? So for a given change in quantity, consumer would need a larger change in price. You okay on this? Now the producer's supply is more elastic. So for a similar change in price, producer says, I will sell this much lesser. अब सप्लाई कर्व ज्यादा इलास्टिक है ना, तो कंज्यूमर कहते हैं अगर चाहते हो कि मैं इतना एक्स्ट्रा खरीदूं D1 S1 तो प्राइस इतना कम करो. प्रोड्यूसर कहते हैं अगर मैं प्राइस इतना कम करूंगा तब तो मैं और कम बेचूंगा. You understand that? The horizontal distance becomes larger now. And again the consumer sees this. The producer is saying, if you want me to reduce the price by this much amount, then I will reduce supply by this much amount, not by this much. You understand that? And now the consumer sees this. And the consumer realizes, oh, there is a huge excess demand. So what do we do now? Consumer says, oh, look, if you are doing that, remember demand is inelastic. So for a given change in quantity, since demand is inelastic, price will rise by an even larger value. तो कंज्यूमर बोलते हैं अगर तुम इतना प्राइस कम कर दिए और उसके वजह से ये एक्सेस डिमांड हो गया, then I am willing to pay this to you. D3, sorry. I hope it's clear to you. So see what's happening? The arrows are going like this and going much beyond the point. अब तो ये इक्विलिब्रियम होगा ही नहीं, ये अनस्टेबल है. It doesn't go back to E1. If you get disturbed from E1, it doesn't go back to E1. What happens now? The consumer sees this, producer says, oh, if you are willing to pay this much, D3, then I'm willing to supply this much. अब मैं चाहता हूं तुम नोटिस करो कि कंज्यूमर ने कहा था ये अगर चाहते हो आप कि क्वांटिटी एक्स्ट्रा में खरीदूं तो प्राइस इतने से कम करो. प्रोड्यूसर ने कहा अगर प्राइस इतने से कम होगा तब तो मैं इतना कम बेचूंगा. तो D1 S1 से बड़ा है ना D2 S2. और कंज्यूमर ने कहा अगर तुम S2 बेचोगे तो मैं D3 देने को तैयार हूं. प्राइस और बढ़ गया. प्रोड्यूसर बोलते हैं अब कंज्यूमर ने S2 D3 ये एक्स्ट्रा प्राइस देने को क्यों तैयार हुए? ये एक्स्ट्रा खरीदने के लिए ना. और प्रोड्यूसर बोले अगर ये एक्स्ट्रा छोड़ो मैं तो इतना एक्स्ट्रा बेचने को फिर तैयार हूं. अभी क्वांटिटी के मुकाबले में प्रोड्यूसर कंज्यूमर से ज्यादा रिएक्ट कर रहे हैं. No, actually both are responding simultaneously once they see a price. No, I'm telling you the story that way. I could have told you the story with consumer also in picture. For example, I can tell you that the consumer says, if you want me to sell S1, then you will have to charge a price D2. So the producer realizes, all right, my next time period price is P2, and therefore the producer chooses a quantity S2. And now the consumer says, look, if the quantity produced is S2, then my willingness to pay is T3. You see, I told you the story the other way. Seems like consumer now, isn't it? The moral of the story is just this much. The moral of the story is, if I am a producer, and please understand that, and my supply is more elastic, then my quantity responsiveness for a given change in price will be larger than the consumer. And in that case, I will end up developing an unstable cobweb. It will never be an equilibrium. I'm going further and further away from it. On the other hand, if I am a producer whose supply is inelastic, then in that case I will respond lesser in quantity terms to consumers' demand and I'll reach equilibrium faster. Now why is that so? Please understand. Because producer is looking at the price prevailing in the previous time period while choosing to supply now, and consumer is choosing to demand on the price based today. So in that case, producer sees, I'm telling you the story again, be careful. मैं फिर से कहानी सुना रहा हूं, सुनना ध्यान से. अब इसको समझो फिर से, वो देखने के बाद. प्रोड्यूसर कहते हैं मैं टाइम पीरियड T0 में देखता हूं प्राइस P1, प्राइस P1 पे मैं बेचने को तैयार हूं S1। क्यों? क्योंकि प्रोड्यूसर को ये S1 कब बेचना है, टाइम पीरियड 1 में या 2 में? आई मीन 0 के बाद 1 में बेचना है, तो टाइम पीरियड 1 में प्रोड्यूसर S1 लेकर आते हैं। लेकिन जब प्रोड्यूसर S1 लेकर आते हैं तो कंज्यूमर क्या खरीदने की बात करते हैं? तो प्रोड्यूसर को दिखता है ये D1 माइनस S1 जितना एक्सेस सप्लाई, तो प्रोड्यूसर कहते हैं ये एक्सेस सप्लाई हो गया, क्या प्राइस रखता मैं कि ये सारी चीजें बिक जाती मेरी? At what price the market would have been exhausted? This becomes an excess supply. What price do I keep so that the market is completely exhausted? So how will the producer get that price? From the demand curve. Now remember, producer wants the consumer to buy this much extra. Consumer's price responsiveness is, if you want to sell me this much extra, reduce your price from P1 to P2. All right? So to buy this much extra, I again insist, मैं फिर से रिपीट कर रहा हूं, ये D1 S1 एक्स्ट्रा खरीदने के लिए बायर कह रहे हैं प्राइस कम करो P1 से P2। लेकिन जब प्राइस कम होता है P1 से P2 तो सेलर जो है वो अपनी क्वांटिटी कम करते हैं, लेकिन ये जो कमी की उन्होंने वो D1 S1 से ज्यादा है या उससे कम है? कम है। क्यों कम है? क्योंकि उनकी सप्लाई इनइलास्टिक है। तो अब कंज्यूमर को ये P2 कब दिखेगा? टाइम पीरियड 2 में। यू अंडरस्टैंड दैट? लेकिन प्रोड्यूसर को ये इस P2 के बेसिस पे किस बात के लिए प्रोड्यूस कर रहे हैं? वो 3 टाइम पीरियड के लिए। यू अंडरस्टैंड दैट? कंज्यूमर्स डिमांड इज बेस्ड ऑन, ओके यू गिव मी P2, I will buy D2. But producer is producing, looking at this P2 for time period 3. Producer produces an S2 and realizes there is an excess demand. Looking at this excess demand, again the consumer says what? If you wanted to sell S2 to me, then you should have charged a price P3 from me. You understand this? Again the producer realizes, oh, consumer's willingness to pay is P3. Next time period the producer sows the crop in a manner where the consumer is willing to pay P3 extra production. अब मैं तुम्हें एक स्टोरी सुना रहा हूं, से ध्यान से सुनना। मैं एक फार्मर हूं, मैं आज मार्केट में जाता हूं अपना 100 केजी अनाज लेकर। मुझे पता चलता है कि अरे ये 100 केजी अनाज के लिए तो 500 रुपए पर केजी मिल रहा है, मैंने तो 300 केजी रुपए पर केजी सोचा था। ठीक है, अब मैं अपना घर आके आता हूं, अगले साल की फसल बोनी है। अगले साल के फसल बोने के लिए मैं कहता हूं ऐसा करते हैं, 500 रुपए केजी का प्राइस है मार्केट में, अकॉर्डिंगली ज्यादा प्रोड्यूस करते हैं, अगले साल ज्यादा बेचेंगे, खूब फायदा कमाएंगे। मैं 500 रुपए पर केजी के हिसाब से फसल बो देता हूं। अब चूंकि मैंने ज्यादा फसल बो दी तो सप्लाई ज्यादा हो गई। अब मैं अगले साल अपना बड़ा वाला बोरा लेकर गया मार्केट में, वहां मुझे पता चला कंज्यूमर कह रहा है भाई बहुत सारी चीजें आ गई हैं, इतने पैसे नहीं देंगे 500, हम तो दे देंगे आपको 300 रुपए। तो मैं देखता हूं अरे 300 रुपए मिलेंगे मुझे, उस साल किसी तरह निपटा के चला आता हूं, थोड़ा नुकसान हो जाता है। अब अगले साल ज्यादा फसल लगाऊंगा या कम लगाऊंगा? कम, वही है ये कम। ऑलराइट, अब अगले साल की फसल आई, अगले साल फसल लेके पहुंचा मार्केट में, कंज्यूमर ने देखा मुझे, अरे ये तो बड़ा कम है, तुम ज्यादा पैसे ले लेते, इससे अच्छा कम क्यों कर दिया? अब ज्यादा लोग आ रहे हैं खरीदने के लिए, ज्यादा लोग आ रहे हैं, मार्केट मुझे P3 दे रहा है। मैं ये P3 देखकर आया मार्केट से, मैं फिर क्या डिसाइड करता हूं, अरे गलती हो गई, थोड़ा सा ज्यादा और करना चाहिए था, थोड़ा ज्यादा कर देता हूं। अगले साल फिर गया, ये S3 हो गया, फिर मार्केट कह रहा है P4 पे आ जाओ। यू अंडरस्टैंड दैट? क्यों? क्योंकि कंज्यूमर वो दाम देंगे जो उन्हें आज दिख रहा है, और मैं वो सप्लाई कर रहा हूं जो मैंने कल देखा था उसके बेसिस पे। यू अंडरस्टैंड दैट? तो ये एनोमली वहीं से आती है। लेकिन चूंकि मेरी सप्लाई की रिस्पॉन्सिवनेस कम है, तो कंज्यूमर जब मुझे प्राइस की वेरिएशन बताते हैं तो मेरे क्वांटिटी सप्लाइड की फ्लक्चुएशन डिमांड के फ्लक्चुएशन से कम होती है, और इसीलिए धीरे धीरे हम वापस इक्विलिब्रियम में आ जाते हैं। आई एम जस्ट रिपीटिंग माई सेल्फ इन इंग्लिश। आई एम सेइंग दैट आई गो टू अ मार्केट, I am a farmer, I sow a crop, I realize that I am getting a price P1. I sow a crop, I produce S1. When I take that crop to the market, I realize that people were not willing to pay P1 for S1, and I realize people are willing to actually pay P2. I have produced a surplus. I now realize, okay, market is not willing to pay P1, market is willing to pay P2. So next year's crop when I sow, I don't sow it with respect to P1 in my mind. I now sow it with respect to P2 in my mind. I sow it, I produce S2. When I produce S2, that implies that now again the price goes up because again the market has a surplus, a shortage. Price goes to P3. But why is the price rising lesser? Because consumers' demand is relatively elastic. So for this much quantity adjustment, consumer will increase the price by a relatively lesser value. So the price rises by a lesser value. Again I go ahead, I see the high price, I again sow more, now I end up producing S3. I again come to the market, I see a surplus. When I see a surplus, I realize, oh, I should have produced less. Market is willing to give me only P4. So this will continue till I finally reach equilibrium. Do I believe it makes sense to you there? And again come back to this. Exactly opposite is happening here because now supply is relatively more flat, demand is steep. So that means the quantity change brought by producer for any responsiveness to price will be much higher, and that will mean that if producer sees the price P1 this year, the producer produces S1, then the producer is told, look, if you had to sell S1, the price should be P2. Now when the producer is going back home, what price is the producer carrying in his mind? P2. And now with P2, the producer says, look, if the market is willing to pay P2, let me sell S2. Now this is a huge change because the producer responds much more to what the consumer was responding. And therefore the market further goes away from equilibrium. Now the consumer's demand is relatively more inelastic. When consumer sees that quantity has fallen by this much, for a given change in quantity, if the demand is inelastic, price change will be even more. And the price change is even more. Looking at this high price change, since supply is elastic, quantity change is even more. Looking at this high quantity change, since demand is inelastic, price change will be even more. Do I get you the last thing that I said? जानबूझ के ऐसे बोल रहा था मैं, मुझे उम्मीद है आप समझे होंगे. ये प्राइस देखकर, क्वांटिटी देखकर कंज्यूमर इतना प्राइस बढ़ाते हैं और इस बढ़े हुए प्राइस को देखकर प्रोड्यूसर इतना सप्लाई बढ़ाते हैं और इस बढ़े हुए सप्लाई को देखकर कंज्यूमर इतना प्राइस कम कर देंगे और इस कम हुए प्राइस को देखकर प्रोड्यूसर और सप्लाई कम कर देंगे. तो प्रोडक्शन डिसीजन कौन ले रहा है? प्रोड्यूसर. और प्राइसिंग का डिसीजन किसके हिसाब से हो रहा है? यू अंडरस्टैंड दैट? The production decision is taken by producer, looking at the price offered by consumer in the previous time period. Do I believe you understand that? And then remember, an exceptional third situation, exceptional in real world, very difficult to find, but an exceptional third situation can arise when both demand curve and supply curve can have same slope. In that case, you will end up having a neutral cobweb. आप ऐसे ही घूमते रह जाओगे. Because consumer will say, if this is the price, you give me a second. If you draw a demand curve and you take a supply curve, say P1, consumer says, look, if you want me to pay this much, I'll pay this. And the producer says, all right, then I will supply this. So the quantity adjustment by consumer matches the quantity adjustment by producer, and the price adjustment by consumer matches the price adjustment by producer. You will never come out of this loop. All right? And this is called neutral cobweb. Never seen in the world in normal circumstance. You will either have stable or you will have unstable cobweb. But this is a theoretical possibility. कि अगर दोनों की elasticity same है, तो दोनों की responsiveness same होगी. तो consumer कहेंगे अगर तुम इतना चाहते हो extra बेचना, तो price इतने कम करो. जब producer price इतना कम करते हैं, तो quantity भी उतने से ही कम कर देते हैं. तो consumer फिर कहता है उसी price पे आ जाओ. उसी price पे आते हैं, फिर वही कहानी शुरू हो जाती है. ऐसा ही चलता रहेगा ये. All right, so that is neutral cobweb. You draw these and then we go ahead. I'll dictate the three things to you. These are all long run equilibrium conditions only. Agricultural market responds more, Srishti. Other markets, the responsiveness is not as much. It is, I'll just take a second. It is not only one producer and consumer, Deepti. There's set of producers and set of consumers. Supply S1 in time T0, Pratishtha. Supply S1 in time T0. इलास्टिसिटी ऑफ प्राइस एंड एमयू में कहां जा रहे हो अब है अभी? इस उम्र में हार्ट अटैक करवा दोगे मुझे तुम. Cobweb model can't take place because of market forces necessarily, Abdul, because demand is decided in current time period price, supply on the previous time period price. Manan, that's an assumption that demand and supply don't change. Perfect, thank you, Manjushri. Yes, perfect knowledge missing. Fair enough, Akanksha. Yes, yes. I had a question. Bolo, bolo. हाँ, एक ही केस होता है, स्टेबल इक्विलिब्रियम वही होगा, बाकी कहीं इक्विलिब्रियम नहीं होता. रियल वर्ल्ड में अगर सोचो तो बहुत जगह पे इक्विलिब्रियम इसलिए नहीं पहुंचते हम कभी. सिंस वो डायनामिक मॉडल है तो लोग रियलाइज नहीं करते कि वो इक्विलिब्रियम में नहीं है. जैसे इतने सारे मोबाइल फोन बनाते हैं, कोई खरीदता नहीं है इक्विलिब्रियम. इतने सारे एसीज पड़े हुए हैं, कोई खरीद नहीं रहा, नहीं है इक्विलिब्रियम. और इतना सारा मिल्क डिमांड कर रहे हैं, मिल नहीं रहा, नहीं है इक्विलिब्रियम. तो हर मार्केट को देखो अगर तो इक्विलिब्रियम में नहीं है, ऐसे ही घूम रहे हैं. ऑलराइट, okay, let's see this. Okay, you take, yes. I'll just take a second. I hope I'm not blocking any of you here. So I feel to be on the safer side. Please, you had a question. Yeah, so with MSP you are assuming that the government can predict the right price and government can offer them in the pre-sowing season so that there can be right type of production that takes place. If MSP is fixed scientifically, you can achieve that. But if MSP is fixed with political populism, which it is done in our country, then it creates more problems. That is why you have excessive production of wheat and rice in India. You understand that? Like even now when somebody says that we have produced less wheat, well, we should say that we have produced lesser wheat as compared to what we did last year. Otherwise, 95 million tons of wheat is not less wheat. You know, I mean, that is what we have produced this year. Or 120 million tons of rice is what we will produce, is not less rice. Or 40 million tons of millet is not less millet. So we got to understand, less and more are relative terms. And look at how we have ignored millets and wheat and rice on pulses, and wheat and rice have picked up. So that's poor MSP fixed again, if you ask me. You know? वो इंस्टेबिलिटी है. देखो, फार्मर्स क्रॉप डिस्ट्रॉय कब करते हैं? जब जरूरत से ज्यादा प्रोड्यूस कर दिए. जरूरत से ज्यादा क्यों प्रोड्यूस कर दिए? इस एक्सपेक्टेशन में कि ये बिक जाएगा या सरकार खरीद लेगी. जब ये दोनों बातें नहीं होती हैं तो कहते हैं हम क्रॉप डंप कर रहे हैं अपना. समझ रहे हो? तो ये रॉन्ग सिग्नल्स लेना होता है मार्केट से. अगर हम रॉन्ग सिग्नल्स लेंगे तो ये गलती होने के चांसेस ज्यादा रहते हैं. ठीक है? सैमुअलसन. इलास्टिसिटी किस पे डिपेंड होता है? अब डिमांड इलास्टिसिटी ले लो, अवेलेबिलिटी ऑफ सब्स्टिट्यूट्स, ठीक है, प्राइस ऑफ रिलेटेड गुड्स, नेसेसिटी है या लग्जरी है. डिमांड इलास्टिसिटी इन्हीं बात पे डिपेंडेंट है. ऐसे ही सप्लाई इलास्टिसिटी डिपेंडेंट है, कॉस्ट प्राइस कितनी है चीजों की, ईज ऑफ प्रोडक्शन है या नहीं. तो इलास्टिसिटी को डिटरमिन करने वाले तो फैक्टर्स होते हैं. एनसीईआरटी खोलना, उसमें दिखेगा तुम्हें. नहीं, इसमें भी सेम बात. देखो, इलास्टिसिटी किसी भी चीज की हो, वो असर चेंज थोड़ी होगा. ये तो हमने दो केसेस ले लिए कि अगर डिमांड ज्यादा इलास्टिक हो, अगर सप्लाई ज्यादा इलास्टिक हो, दो केसेस ले लिए। इसमें एक बात और ध्यान रखना, ये दो इलास्टिसिटी अलग अलग टाइम पीरियड से रिस्पॉन्ड कर रहे हैं। सप्लाई इज रिस्पॉन्डिंग टू प्राइस इन टाइम पीरियड t-1, demand is responding to time period price in time period t. So their elasticities will reflect that time lag also. You're operating with a lag model here. The supply is not coming immediately. Supply operates with a lag. I see a price today and then I operate tomorrow. It's like that. I hope you have drawn this by now. No, but then in that case, that's the whole market, no? I mean, a market is always the entire market. So you will add export market to the existing market. If you have surplus at home, you can export abroad. So the demand curve should internalize it, isn't it? That way. Okay, you write this down then. You write in case of cobweb model, in case of cobweb model, there is possibility of stable equilibrium, comma, unstable equilibrium, and neutral equilibrium. You change the paragraph and write, and give a heading, write stable equilibrium. Stable equilibrium. No. Actually what happens is, if you begin with an equilibrium and then disturb it, you go away from equilibrium. So unstable model. So you can call it stable cobweb, unstable cobweb, but finally it's about equilibrium. Alright, that whether you disturb, like here if I disturb myself from equilibrium, I'll still come back to it. But there I won't. Alright, that way. Okay, you write in that, in a stable model, supply curve is inelastic as compared to demand curve. And I again repeat it for you. Supply responds to the price in time period t-1 and demand responds to the time period t price. Alright, remember that always. In the same thing you write, if market begins initially at time t0, when I say t0, I mean t with a suffix 0. Alright, at time t0, then producer observes a price P1, comma, supplies quantity S1 to the market, and realizes that in time period T1, comma, at price P1, consumer is willing to purchase only D1, full stop. To sell quantity S1, to sell quantity S1, comma, consumer is willing to pay P2 as reflected by point D2, as reflected by point D2 on demand curve, as reflected by point D2 on demand curve, full stop. Therefore, price observed by the seller, price observed by the seller at the end of time period 1, at the end of time period 1 is P2. I hope I am clear to you on all this. Alright, at the end of time period 1, the price observed is this, P2. अब time period 2 में seller supply करेंगे S2. Alright, that is the story I am taking forward. You write, therefore, quantity supplied in time period 2 is S2, but given price P2, consumer demands D2 in this time period. Given price P2, consumer demands D2 in this time period. That's in front of us. P2 प्राइस पे कंज्यूमर तो D2 ही डिमांड करेंगे. आप अभी आगे की कहानी सुन लो, मुझे पता है मन में क्या आपके पीड़ा आ रही है, वो भी दूर हो जाएगी. Alright, but remember, producer produces at P2 the amount S2. We know by the demand curve that if the price is kept at P2, the buyer will buy D2. You understand that? You write in that this creates excess demand. This creates excess demand, and in order to sell exactly D2 or S2, in order to sell exactly S2, the market price suggested is P3. Market price suggested is P3, which is reflected by point D3 on demand curve. Therefore, price observed at the end of time period 2 by the seller is P3. I hope we are clear on that, and I hope you understand what is happening now. So I'm stopping the story here. Alright, we won't go into D4 and S4 now, assuming that you know that, okay, this is the way cobweb is moving. So you go in the same thing, you write, this adjustment process will continue. This adjustment process will continue until market reaches equilibrium at point E. Market reaches equilibrium at point E, creating a cobweb of price and quantity adjustment. Creating a cobweb of price and quantity adjustment. No, cobweb model is must for nothing, Vrishabh. उधर सोचो ही मत, गलत सोच रहे हो. No, divergent and stable are not same, Abdul. Now you write, change the paragraph and write, stability in the market. Remember, I'll make you write this. This is what you call a convergent cobweb. Alright, this is what you call a convergent cobweb. And that is what you call a divergent cobweb. Alright, that is the basic idea. I'll make you write that. You write, stability in the market is also called a convergent cobweb model. Convergent cobweb model. God bless you. Because a convergent cobweb model, because the market reaches an equilibrium where producer's decision based on price in T-1, producer's decision based on price in T-1 and consumer's decision based on price in time t converge at same quantity and price. Converge at same quantity and price. Change the paragraph again. For a given change in price, for a given change in price, in a bracket you write, as directed by consumer, because remember the price fall or price rise is what the consumer is offering to the producer. So as directed by the consumer. And why do we say consumer is offering to the producer? Because the producer will see that price in current time period and then choose to produce for the next time period. Consumer will see that price in the current time period and then choose to produce for the next time period. So consumer is kind of offering the price to the producer. All right. As directed by consumer, close the bracket. Could you tell me the line you wrote before the bracket? Yeah. For a given change in price, adjustment of quantity by the seller is lesser than the quantity adjustment expected by the buyer. In a bracket you write, ये जो ब्रैकेट में मैं आपको लिखवा रहा हूं ये बस तुम्हारी समझ के लिए है, क्योंकि जब एक साल बाद इन बातों को देखोगे ना तो बस धुंधली धुंधली याद रहेगी. So the point in the bracket is for that. All right, you write within the bracket you write, for a change in price from P1 to P2, consumer is willing to adjust demand. For a change in price from P1 to P2, consumer is willing to adjust demand from D1 to S1, the horizontal line, first up, D1 to S1, and for the same change in price, producer is willing to change quantity from D2 to S2, and D2 S2 is lesser than, let's put the lesser than sign, D2 S2 is lesser than D1 S1. I'm sure it's evidently clear to you. Yeah? And that is you close the bracket now and you write, this happens because supply is more inelastic. Supply is more inelastic as compared to demand. This happens because supply is more inelastic as compared to demand. So we are explaining why cobweb becomes stable. Alright. You then write below that, you give a heading, you write unstable cobweb. Unstable cobweb. In that you write, if demand is relatively more inelastic if demand is relatively more inelastic compared to supply, then any disturbance from equilibrium point will result in creating a divergent path that is, the market will never come back to equilibrium. Now, you know the explanation D1 S1 remains the same. The only difference is in the responsiveness of quantity demanded and quantity supplied. So I'm making you write that. I'm assuming that once you have written that initial demand D1, S1, time period T0, price P1, that story remains the same, no change. That is why I have kept the language also same D1, same S1, D2, S2, and so on. But the change is in the responsiveness of quantity to a given change in price. So you write, in this case, if there is excess supply, D1 S1 at price P1, if there is excess supply D1 S1 at price P1, then quantity remove the word quantity. You write then price adjustment by consumer will be larger in a bracket you write P1 P2 will be larger P1 P2 because demand is relatively inelastic. In a bracket you write, for a given change needed in quantity, price will change by proportionately higher value. I hope it makes sense to you there. For a given change needed in quantity, price will change by a proportionately higher value because demand is relatively inelastic. You know, inelastic means price changes more than quantity. So for a given change in quantity, price will change by a larger value. close the bracket. Alright, close the bracket. Then you write similarly, when price falls from P1 to P2, supply adjustment S2 D2 is larger, supply adjustment S2 D2 is larger than S1 D1 because supply is more elastic than demand. Supply is more elastic than demand. This shows that every change in price brought from demand side, I'm sure all of us understand this, that change in price is happening from the demand side. So every change in price brought from demand side will become higher than the previous time period and every change in quantity and quantity change is coming from which side? Demand side or supply side? Supply side. So every change in quantity coming from supply side will also be higher than the previous change. Therefore, market will go on a divergent path compared to previous equilibrium. Do I believe we are clear on the story? Now that makes it easier for me to tell you neutral again. Imagine in a neutral cobweb what will happen? We start at a point P1. The initial excess supply is D1 S1. The consumers tell the producers, reduce the price from P1 to P2. We will be willing to buy S1. Producers reduce the price from P1 to P2. So producers now observe a price P2. The responsiveness of the producer is same now as that of the consumer. So the quantity falls from D2 to S2 by exactly the same amount that was D1 S1. Now what happens? Again the market reaches a point S2 which is also D1. I'm sure you can acknowledge that on the x-axis. Whatever is D2 is D1 is S2, and the producer feels that okay, now I have an excess demand of S2 D2, So how much extra price I would have got, and what is that extra price they will have got? Back to D1 or P1. Why? Because the responsiveness of consumer to a given change in supply, excess demand is same as the responsiveness of producer to a given change in excess supply. तो जितने से कंज्यूमर प्राइस बढ़ाएंगे प्रोड्यूसर भी उतने से ही बढ़ाने वाले थे, और जितना से कंज्यूमर प्राइस कम करेंगे प्रोड्यूसर से भी उतने से ही करने वाले थे. You get into a neutral cobweb thing. I'm again repeating it in case you lost it somewhere. I'm saying that you start at a price P1, you have a quantity D1, supply S1, producer realizes I have an excess supply, producer tries finding out how much I should have charged so that this excess supply had not arisen. Suppose we say that the producer should have charged, that which the producer should have charged should have been P2. Producer charges a price P2 for the next time period. When producer charges a price P2, since the responsiveness of demand is same as responsiveness of supply, that means again the price rises responding to this situation. The consumers raise the price back to P1. Again at P1 the producer sees this D1, producer has produced S1, same reaction will happen. Producer will again believe that price should be reduced to P2, and you keep moving in this loop throughout. And that is called a neutral cobweb. Do I believe you understand this? I'm just completing it. You write below that, if both demand and supply have the same elasticity, if both demand and supply have the same elasticity, then it means that responsiveness of quantity to any given change in price, responsiveness of quantity to any given change in price by consumer will remain same in a bracket you write D1 S1 is equal to D2 S2. D1 S1 is equal to D2 S2. And you write this will result in neutral cobweb that is a loop will be formed in which the market will keep moving. This is observed only when price elasticity of demand and price elasticity of supply match each other. The good part is that when they have asked you a question from Cobweb, they have asked you straightforward questions. Like they have not even asked you till now to explain why inelastic has stability and elastic has instability, supply that is. ये भी नहीं पूछा आज तक. Alright, मैं clarity के लिए फिर बता दूं. If supply is inelastic compared to demand, then stable. And if ये board पे दिख भी रहा होगा तुम्हें, तो confusion होना नहीं चाहिए वैसे. But still, supply is steeper, inelastic compared to demand, then stable. And supply is more elastic compared to demand, then unstable. But again, till now, if you look at the past year papers, they are mainly focusing on supply and demand elastic. Cobweb stable, unstable, and neutral. At times, they can at best ask you what is the condition needed for a stable Cobweb. Now that's simple. An inelastic supply is the condition needed. Normally, they stick to 10 markers in this. Normally, they have stuck to that, the 10-mark question, and they ask you stable, unstable, kind of a thing. तो 10 नंबर में ही पूछे जाती हैं ये चीजें. जो भी बातें माइक्रो में अभी तक हमने डिस्कस की, except for consumer equilibrium for Marshall, equimarginal utility that is, except for that, they are all 10 markers. Law of equimarginal utility, sometimes they can put it for 20 marks. If they put it for 20 marks, then you should be writing assumptions and all also in it. Alright, if they put it for 20 marks, then you should be putting assumptions, etc. also in it. Alright, anything for 20 marks, they are expecting you to write the whole story. Then they don't want you to have any. But then be careful about the question. If there is a particular thing they are asking, the focus has to be there. But they want you to explain it as much as possible. Alright, now you just give a heading. You write ordinal utility theory. I'm just introducing it to you. Yes, yes. No, the price will be lesser than equilibrium, you mean that? No, you could have started the story here. And we could have said that at S2, D2, again they see excess demand. Due to excess demand, they will reach D3, S3, and the story goes on. So you can pick it up anywhere. It's kind of a circular thing. All right. In this, you just write a line. You write, and ordinal utility theory was given by Professor J.R. Hicks. In fact, Professor Hicks is called the father of modern economics because he was the one who gave indifference curve theory that kind of revolutionized consumer behavior, and he gave the ISLM model. Neo-Keynesians as they were called, Hicksian theory entirely. Professor Hicks had an Indian contemporary, at Cambridge. He was called Mr. Gorakhnath. Mr. Gorakhnath was from Bihar. He was at Cambridge, and he would be Hicks's contemporary, and he had beaten Hicks in his undergraduate days all 3 years. And even in the masters, 1 out of 2 years he had beaten Hicks. Now, Hicks is called by Indian Prime Minister in 1960 to advise on India's economic issues. Now, Hicks comes to India and says that you have Gorakhnath, why are you looking for me? So now nobody knows Gorakhnath. That who is this person? Where is he? But now the Prime Minister searches for him. Who is this Gorakhnath about whom J.R. Hicks is talking? So now they find Mr. Gorakhnath as a professor at Patna College in Patna. He's called along, Hicks meets him with a lot of greetings. And the interesting part is that there is no such recording that I got in India. I was reading all these stories at Cambridge. There they have a whole memorabilia that they have kept. And I was on an exchange program at Cambridge. And that's where I got to know about Gorakhnath. Incidentally, I was also born at Patna, so my interest went up. Because the whole title of that whole memorabilia was the man from Patna who mesmerized Hicks. So that who is this man from Patna who mesmerized Hicks? So I started reading into that, and then I tried finding something more on Gorakhnath. So something interesting had happened with him. He had written a PhD thesis, And many claim that his PhD thesis was on rational expectation theory, which actually macroeconomics saw around 30 years later as compared to 1947-48 when he had written his PhD thesis. So he writes his PhD thesis, goes out for a walk because he feels very nice that, okay, my thesis is complete and I've found something nice, new thing. Goes out for a walk, comes back, asks his wife to make tea. The wife gives him tea. Now he comes here, goes into his room, and he finds that the thesis papers are missing. Don't forget, they were not those of days of computer and all. Everything had to be handwritten. And he asks the wife that, what did you do? What happened to these papers that were kept here? And wife said, I made tea out of that. And he gave up. After that, he never, see, the moral of the story is choose your spouse carefully. but anyways, now, so he gave up after that. He never did research. He was a very brilliant fellow, so he became a professor at Patna College. There were some very interesting, funny anecdotes of his at Patna College. He retired as the principal over here, and Patna College in those days used to have a huge reputation, 50s and 60s. So he retired over there. But then, I just tell this story to my students because, that is where India loses out on its academicians. We don't value them at times. No, not because of marriage, but because of lack of value. we don't value them at times, and we lose out on some good ones. So I just thought I should tell you. But I'll just complete this line for you. So you write in that, the theory of ordinal utility, the theory of ordinal utility is based on ranking of consumption baskets by individuals, defined by their preferences. Just one clarification I am giving you here, because one of your friend asks me online. Remember, we say inelastic and elastic relatively. Like, I don't mean at all that elasticity less than 1 is inelastic and greater than 1 is elastic. I'm only saying inelastic and elastic relatively. So supply is inelastic compared to demand. Demand is inelastic compared to supply. That talk we are doing. All right, then today we will stay on that. आप मुझे ऐसे घड़ी भी दिखाते रहते हो कभी हो गया तुम्हारा वक्त पूरा. But anyway, so we'll stay on that. Tomorrow we'll begin with ordinal utility and indifference curves. Thank you. I'll see you then. We can say that, Anusha, I'll just take a second. Online people, I'm leaving you here today. If you have a doubt, you can ask me on the message, Telegram that is. You can send me a personal message too. I have a little bit of a hurry today, but you can see me tomorrow, of course, after the class. Thank you.